Okay, we're going to engage in a fireside chat, which is very appropriate for a blizzardy day. And then there'll be opportunities for the audience to chime in as well. So first of all, thanks for a great talk.
Oh, sure. Thank you. My pleasure.
Very interesting. I want to go back to the beginning of your talk where you were talking about the balance between government and the governed, which in my mind sets up the government as the principal antagonist in terms of surveillance and its intrusion into the private sphere. But in our phone call to prepare for this presentation, we also talked about the public having perhaps a more acute preoccupation with the behavior of private entities like Facebook. And could you say a little bit more about why you think the public perceives Facebook as a more malevolent actor than, say, the NSA or the federal government?
Yeah, well, first I want to say I don't view government as necessarily the antagonist because, there are times when it's legitimate for government to engage in surveillance. So under human rights, we say that the surveillance needs to be done in accordance with the law. In other words, the government shouldn't be breaking the law. And it needs to be necessary and proportionate to some legitimate goal. So there are times when you want the government to be able to wiretap, say, mobsters. And it has its place. But my sense is that and in doing this research, it's difficult because so much of this information about what the government does is either classified or a very closely guarded secret. As I was mentioning earlier about parallel construction, the government has ways of hiding things from courts and defendants and therefore keeping it from reaching constitutional scrutiny to say, is this constitutional or not? And so when it comes to government surveillance, I often feel like I'm shadowboxing. I'm trying to research something that the government doesn't really want you to know about or be able to document. And I think sometimes the public maybe has that sense as well. Not only do Americans maybe trust the government more, rightly or wrongly, and again I would challenge us to think about if you trust the NSA, do you trust your local police force and vice versa? I suppose because we all are, almost all of us are using Google or Facebook or Twitter or one of these companies, it feels more immediate. Whereas government surveillance not only is so secretive, I think to many of us it feels abstract. If that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I think part of it is also that the engagement you have with something like Facebook or Twitter as a user is a pretty intimate engagement, and you are exposing fairly many people, exposing very personal things about themselves, and so the sense of injury, I think, is more acute in the case where that's turned around and used against you or used in ways that you didn't, sanction, as opposed to the government and, bunkers full of smart guys like Snowden or whatever sitting around somewhere, pouring through your phone traffic.
And smart women. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Smart women too. Well, we're not all off the hook, are we? Yeah.
I think you're probably right about that. I mean, I think we all have a sense that we have the right to communicate, and we're using these tools for a reason. I use Twitter, because these tools give us a means of doing something that we want to do. And yeah, I think often we're making trade-offs that we shouldn't have to make. And even with respect to the companies, I think we often feel disempowered because we don't have many choices for alternative platforms. And so I do think that, even in talking about data privacy day, that phrase data privacy, for whatever reason, conjures the companies for us. But I think we should also realize that these actors are deeply interconnected. Anything that Facebook has, law enforcement and the intelligence agencies can get. Same with any other platform. And so I think maybe sometimes they're separated in our minds in a way that they shouldn't necessarily be.
Right, and work that Florian has done, for example, has looked at why these interfaces to the mechanisms available to you to protect your privacy are so obtuse. So just a little plug there, Florian. So let's take up this question of surveillance. I was really interested in the example you gave of the lantern laws in New York City. I didn't know about that. That's very interesting, and think about surveillance and the act of surveillance as a broader corroding influence. So if you assume that there's some kind of social bargain that we're all engaging in, it can be quite disorienting to discover that, for example, your fellow citizens were regularly spying on you, as was the case when the Stasi archive was made public and people in East Germany realized that lifelong friends were actually, collaborating with the government and so forth. Can you say a little bit more about those kind of corroding aspects and kind of undermining the bargain between the governed and the government?
Yeah, and I think it's not, so we see the same power disparity between ordinary internet users, like most of us in this room, I assume, and the companies. I was talking with one of your students earlier about the concept of consent, and I think this can really help us to think through this. So in the Me Too era, a lot of us are thinking about consent and who gets to draw boundaries and who needs to respect those boundaries, and kind of the making sure that there are balances of power and that everyone's humanity is recognized. And I think that that same concept can be illuminating in the digital rights context, where we have companies that assert the ability to define what consent means, regardless of what we think we've consented to. And I think that there is a really corrosive effect where you place your trust in something, perhaps, or someone is just given the authority to do something and then winds up betraying that trust and betraying that power. And I do think that that can have a real corrosive effect on society, again, for some of the same reasons that we see in the women's rights movement, that when you have that kind of unchecked power, it's so easy to commit abuses, and that really does, it does. It corrodes society for many of us.
So at lunch we were talking about this recent case that a colleague of ours surfaced with Airbnb, where he had contracted with Airbnb to use a property, and then when he and his family moved in, discovered to his horror that there were video cameras in the living space of the apartment. And when he contacted Airbnb customer service, they asserted that the images of the apartment showing the cameras represented disclosure, and that he knew that when he signed the agreement, and therefore he didn't have a basis for complaint. Now later, when it got higher in the chain of command, they decided it really did need to be spelled out in the legal terms and so forth. But I think what this raises is there's an incredible capacity now for individuals to engage in intrusive behavior through things like, webcams and stick-em cams and drones and so forth. Where do you see that part of the surveillance sphere coming into play?
Well, I guess what I could comment on, so I don't want to talk about Airbnb specifically because I don't want to step outside my mandate. But again, I want to come back to what the GDPR tries to accomplish. And the GDPR takes a very consent-based view of the world that tries to recognize that it's your data, right? You're the one who should be in control, that there is this sphere of you. And so I think when a company or a government tries to define for itself what your consent means and what it extends to, that's really problematic, and there need to be checks in place. And in the US in particular, I think we need laws to really regulate that, so we can make societal decisions, and so that individuals are more empowered to decide for themselves, am I going to consent to this or not? And I ought to be able to use these services without my purported consent being exploited and used against me.
So speaking of the GDPR, why do you think it emerged within the EU and has had a kind of a more hospitable reception than comparable things have on this side of the Atlantic?
Well, I have EU citizenship, but I am not from Europe, so I have to tread carefully. I do think it's a historical experience, what I just discussed and what you've alluded to as well, the ways that data was used to facilitate the Holocaust, the things that happened in East Germany, Romania. There are a number of notorious surveillance regimes that emerged in Europe, and my best guess is that the European attitude toward privacy rights and data privacy rights very much grew out of that acute awareness of how personal information can be abused when it falls into the wrong hands, and it's not that hard for it to fall into the wrong hands.
And then sort of to wrap up the fireside part of this, and then we'll open it up to the floor. I was happy to hear you talk about Virginia Eubank's work. She was just here a couple weeks ago, so she was setting you up in some sense. And it was interesting in her talk the degree to which she described these horrifying scenarios of elicitation merely to obtain social service benefits, which we would think would be a kind of a birthright, and now suddenly you have to answer chapter and verse about your drug-taking behavior or your sexual behavior or your marriage history or whatever. And so you defined that as an affront, and I agree, but what I found more frightening in her description was the extent to which these social service agencies then sort of hand in glove with firms like IBM and whatever were developing these vast algorithmic engines that would then kind of graze over these data and then be used to make predictive models that then were, not only were they intruding on people's privacy, but then they were using that data against them to exclude them from subsequent service. So
You just defined exploitation.
yes.
Yeah, where things are taken from us and with really no benefit to us and often harm to us. And I think that so Human Rights Watch is going to be increasing its work on artificial intelligence. We're hiring an artificial intelligence researcher. We're really actively thinking about predictive modeling and AI. And I want to propose that often predictive models are a mirror. They're created by humans. These algorithms are created by humans, and we need to look at, what goals do they have, what functions do they serve, and then what results do they produce. And I think sometimes when they don't produce the results that the authorities expect, those algorithms wind up getting tweaked. And similarly, it's humans who decide what factors go into those algorithms. They decide what's relevant. And so I think it becomes this very high-tech sheen over, kind of the existing prejudices and decision-making. It makes it look objective. And I think this is going to be increasingly a problem in the courts as well, is we have this technology that looks objective because it's tech. But again, it was creative, designed by humans with their own priorities, biases, et cetera.
Yeah, I think there was a little Twitter spat last week between AOC and some alt-right person about whether algorithms were objective or biased. And I think the overwhelming signal from the AI community was, yeah, of course they're biased. It's kind of built into the premise. One of the interesting things that Eubank said in her presentation is the sheen of rationality that cloaks these things becomes an important rationale for their adoption. And then they are also often packaged by the vendors as enormous cost-saving mechanisms, but also efficiency. We will get the services to those people who need it immediately, et cetera, and obviously that's not happening.
So I think it was Cathy ONeil, the data scientist. She wrote Weapons of Math Destruction, which I'm sure many of you will have read, has written that models are opinions embedded in mathematics. And I agree, it's not only disturbing that that's happening, especially regarding things that are so consequential for people, bail algorithms, algorithms that decide whether you get the social welfare benefits you need to survive. And that there are private companies then profiting off of the creation of these seemingly objective tools that actually maybe just tell us what we want to hear.
I think the most frightening example she told was of children who were taken from their parents as a function of predictive model that suggests that the parents would be abusive, and it was purely an artifact of an overweighted factor in the model.
And again, who does this affect? It affects the poor. You have to look at who these algorithms are being deployed against or vis-a-vis, if you like. I don't think anyone's running around doing predictive modeling on whether wealthier people are going to abuse their children. It's people who have had contacts with social services already, is my understanding of her work.
Yeah, no, definitely it was, and often it would be perfectly innocent, but in the context of the model was then weighted as a negative factor, and then the model can't be wrong, and so then the children would be removed from their parents and so forth.
Stress again the idea. I think judicial education is going to be key because, again, for so many judges, I think that this tech is going to look objective, and you're going to have government agencies or prosecutors saying it's objective, it's just math. And I think that anyone in the room who's inclined to be a defense attorney or inclined to be a tech expert, an expert witness, needs to help and push back and educate and say, that it's not just sort of objective science, that these really are opinions embedded in mathematics.
Okay, so now it's your turn. If you would just step to the microphones on either side of the room and have at it. Florian, how are we handling questions from the streaming audience? There's a Twitter hashtag, right? Okay, go ahead.
Hello, my name's Abraham, and I guess my question had to do with the right of people to sell their own data. In that, do you think it should be allowed, or like if people were able to sell their own data, if it could lead to like economic coercion, or sort of like, and especially if you sell your own data, it's not really your own data, it affects other people. So what are people's thoughts of like my ability to sell my data to whatever company I want or whatever entity?
Civil rights community, this idea that there ought to be a recognition that your data has value is an idea that's been out there and I think maybe gaining some currency, as it were, over time. And so, for example, Senator Ron Wyden has proposed a data privacy bill that would embrace exactly that idea that companies could get your data, but they would have to pay you for it, and maybe in the form of a one-time payment, say. So it's not necessarily that you would suddenly have to pay for social media services or search services that are now free, but that they would actually pay you. We don't have a position on that. I'm not sure that I have a position on that, but I do think that at least, I think you raise an interesting point that it's usually not just your data, right? It's not just information about you. It will often be information about others. And again, are they really consenting to this? And that's a really fascinating question, and one I'm glad you raised. I'm not sure that we've collectively been thinking about that. But I think at least the recognition that our data is monetized. Like the reason these companies are so wealthy is that our data has value, and that many of us are not benefiting from that. We're being offered this service, but does that service really compensate? Is it really the same as, is it as valuable as what we're quote unquote giving away? So I think that the concept is important. Whether it can or should be codified is another question.
Other questions?
A lot of groups with economic disparity and differences. I'm curious to know how you feel about corrections, because corrections is using a lot of data about, in the same way that insurance companies do, to see if someone will reoffend or someone is likely to get sick. I think it came up relatively recently in Florida where they were incorrectly weighting how much a previous offender would be likely to reoffend, and then placing more surveillance on that particular individual. And I was wondering what your thoughts were about that, because we still focus a lot on what is our debt to society and whether or not that constitutes information privacy as well.
So I know that this is not something I work on, but Human Rights Watch has taken a position against bail algorithms, precisely, I think, because who decides what gets factored into that, and shouldn't it really be a judge making an individualized determination based on the facts of the case, and why are we using this model, and how are we choosing the factors that go into it, and how are we weighting the factors that go into that, and is that really objective, and is it really fair? And so while it's not like working on algorithms in the criminal justice context in that sense is not my area of expertise. I think you're right that, yeah, there are definitely questions to be raised about who's deciding what the relevant information is, and is it ever really right to take that decision away from a judge and put it in the hands of an algorithm, and why do we think that that is better? I understand that some people think it will be more objective and reduce bias, but I don't think that that's what we've seen so far. I think many people are concerned that the algorithms will just replicate bias, in part because of what's included, and in part because if the outcome doesn't match what we expect, then all of a sudden the authorities intervene and correct what the product was.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for the great talk and chat. So you mentioned the GDPR earlier, the General Data Protection Regulation, and how it's a more consent-based approach. Now, the GDPR has a couple of other legitimate bases for processing companies can use or entities can use to process data, including legitimate business interests. And I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on how that might affect basically surveillance past the consent, right? So there's this discussion currently happening right now whether tracking people for advertising requires consent or whether it's a legitimate business interest.
I don't pretend to be an expert in the GDPR, and I think that's what that points out, though, is that the GDPR, so the great thing about it is it contains, some really broad ideas and some interesting new protections, and I think the difficulty is we often don't know what those means, and it's going to be left to the courts in EU countries and the Court of Justice of the EU to then define what it means. And I think that there are definitely some real open-ended questions, not only about how it works in practice, but yeah, about what exactly it allows for. And I think that there are many human rights activists who feel that it doesn't go far enough. I think some of us, like my organization, think it's a good start, but that it certainly has its imperfections. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I'm hoping that, EU privacy advocates are looking at that and thinking about it from a human rights perspective. I should say that the right to data protection, so I'm going to nerd out for a second. The Charter of Fundamental, as if I haven't been for the past hour, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU is basically like the EU's human rights treaty. And it includes not only a right to privacy, but explicitly a right to the protection of personal data, which I think is just wonderful and fascinating. What that means is that in Europe, you basically have a kind of constitutional right that the Court of Justice will have to apply, like as a fundamental right, that you have a right to the protection of your personal data. It's foundational. I just think that's wonderful.
Question from Sierra Bolson online. This is for Sarah. Do you have any thoughts on the use of data and modeling in fundraising?
I mean, I guess the same questions that I raise about data privacy and about modeling are kind of true across the board. It's not that modeling is never legitimate. I just think that scholars who work in this field tend to look not only at they look at things like transparency and accountability. So what kind of factors are going into the model? You know, if to the extent that we have machine learning, do we have insight into what factors the machine starts to incorporate by, or the algorithm, you know, this learning mechanism starts to incorporate by itself, and how do we hold algorithms or their producers accountable for bad outcomes, for malfunctioning, and so on. And so I'm not sure if I totally understand what's meant by fundraising. I think that I would ask those same questions about, you know, is this mechanism subject to sufficient regulation and accountability?
So I do quite a bit of fundraising in my day job, and I think one of the things that we may aspire to as a kind of holy grail of advancement is some way of boiling the 600,000 strong alumni base of the University of Michigan, of which you are one member, and then finding those people who have not given but might perhaps have a greater proclivity to give, as a way of kind of tuning our pitch and our attention so that we're not trying to reach all 600,000, but we've got our attention focused on those people who may be at some critical inflection point and so forth. And from the point of view of the fundraisers, we see that gathering all available data to tune that algorithm is a worthy end. But we often encounter, on the behalf of alumni who are contacted as a result of these things, a sense of affront or surprise. Is that, how did you find me? Or why are you talking to me now? And that kind of a thing.
Yeah, and so I think, again, I would come back to the idea of those core ideas that wind up in the GDPR of have you consented to this, and can you object? Can you opt out? Can you ask for your data to be deleted or corrected or updated or whatever the case may be? Like, are we placing at least some measure of control back in the hands of the data subject, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and I'd have to say probably not at this point, because we're doing the same things that Facebook might do. We're mining some gargantuan corpus of data to try to yield the nuggets of insight that will help us be more successful at fundraising, which is probably a morally defensible goal in most ways. But
yeah, and I think the bigger point to be made is that institutions shouldn't be left to have to figure this out for themselves necessarily. That's really long past time for Congress to take action. These are big questions, and that's Congress's job, is to look at these by now very well established phenomena of data mining, of predictive algorithms, and so on, and take some action to make sure that people are protected and that we're striking the right balance in these areas between legitimate interests and people's desire for privacy and control over that sphere of the self.
So what do you see as the future of a kind of Hippocratic oath type approach that we might take with information professionals in training that would inculcate within them a kind of a moral compass or ethical direction that would lead them to object when they see people engaging in nascent warrantless mass surveillance or exploitative use of data and so forth, and therefore not necessarily having to regulate or legislate everything, but depend a little bit on, say, professional codes of conduct.
Well, I'm an attorney, and so my answer is always, but I think, of course, it's a good thing, and I think that we should all be aware of those historical phenomena that I talked about earlier, about the ways that government surveillance has been seriously misused, or the ways that data collection, including in Europe in the past and also here, has been seriously misused. And so, sure, I think that ethical training is a wonderful idea, but I don't think it's a substitute for law. I'd put it that way.
But I mean, I would guess, as a matter of course, most intro CS programs don't talk about the Fourth Amendment that much.
I think we should. I think everyone, like in the United States, we have this love of the First Amendment, and we should, because of course free speech is so foundational to a democratic society. But I think we forget that the Fourth Amendment, again, privacy is that gateway right that lets us do those things, that lets us have the freedom of religion, lets us have the freedom of speech. And so I actually wish that all of us were taught more about the Fourth Amendment and about the principles underlying it, and we ought to, we ought to celebrate that every bit as much as we do the First Amendment, because actually, I think for the Constitution's drafters, those two things were both rooted in those general warrants I talked about earlier, this really unchecked government authority, not only to get into, were you smuggling something, but what were you thinking or saying or writing about the Crown authorities? So those two rights are deeply tied, and I think we ought to be talking about the Fourth Amendment more as a culture.
Other questions from the audience or online? Oh, go ahead, Charles.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. I appreciate it. You've spoken a bunch about the GDPR, and looking back towards the United States, we don't have a foundational privacy framework. Do you see that the way forward is going to be more evolutional with a lot of smaller laws that are being brought into place, or do you see the need for a more fundamental structure?
So my organization, partly at my instigation, has called for a data privacy law that would really grapple with the basic principles, and I think the way data in general is treated, because I think what you're pointing to is correct, that the U.S. currently has a patchwork of laws in some areas. We have HIPAA, the Health Information Privacy Act. We have student privacy. We have the Privacy Act of 1974, which regulates to some extent what government agencies can share with each other, but there's no, not what the Europeans would call your sort of omnibus data protection law. And I think that in the United States, people are really suffering the consequences of that, and that a comprehensive approach is really badly needed at this point, because as long as there are loopholes or areas that are left uncovered or less covered, there are those who are going to exploit that.
Okay, so because we're at a university, I'm going to ask you this question we often ask speakers is, so you were English and East Asian Studies as an undergrad, and now you're working for Human Rights Watch on, surveillance and privacy. Can you connect the dots for us? I think that's an interesting journey.
Thank you. Well, so I want to say two things, both of which are true. One is that I was very well taught at Michigan. I was lucky to go to a law school that, I don't know if this is still the case, but transnational law was required for everyone, and the law school really required everyone to be able to demonstrate a grasp of international law and that international perspective, and really valued it. And I also had great criminal law and procedure and evidence teachers, and I think that the university really had a view toward the rights of the vulnerable, and interest in public interest law was actively encouraged. I got a lot of encouragement and really great training here, for which I'm grateful. In terms of East Asian studies, when I was an undergrad and in graduate school, I focused mostly on the history and anthropology of Vietnam and Cambodia. And I think it gave me a healthy skepticism about government claims and the government's propensity for abuse, and also for not always disclosing abuse, and for really thorny issues about individual accountability and what the public should know, what the public deserves to know about what the government is doing. So I actually think that those things are very, in a way, although I'm not literally a child of the 70s, I sort of am. I think I have the kind of skepticism that a long period of focusing on the Vietnam War and what the U.S. did in Cambodia, that the perspective that it gives you of, that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that people have a right to know what's going on. And that, like I said, it's good to ask questions. It's good to ask questions about what the government does and why.
Okay, so on campus we're often talking about climate change and so forth, and those can often be somewhat daunting conversations because it's not clear at the end of the day what one individual could do to make things better. And I have the same feeling about these privacy conversations. So what one set of action items would you propose to us as individuals that we can take to address many or some of the concerns that you've raised?
Yeah, well, I think at the most basic level, if you're a U.S. voter, call your representatives in Congress and let them know that you care about the issues. I've been in congressional offices when those phones have been ringing. They do pay attention. They do care. People might think they don't. I think they do. And I think just embracing this in daily life, and honestly, sometimes it's just about reading. It's just about educating yourself. Books that you mentioned, like Virginia Eubanks or Simone Brown Stark Matters, some things I've mentioned in this talk, just learning about this and learning about how it's connected to other issues you might care about, such as immigration, such as criminal justice. It's all information. It's all a deeply connected web when it comes to these issues. I think that we can also destigmatize certain technologies. I use Tor. I use Tor all the time. I use Signal, and some of my friends now use Signal as well, and these are sort of encryption apps that, and I know the government sometimes likes to give some side eye, if you like, to, and that's putting it mildly, the government really likes to undermine the legitimacy of encryption as practiced by all of us. But it's a really important technology for defending our rights and civil liberties. So I think that, yeah, those would be my main statements would be, think about how this is relevant to whatever you care about. Practice what you preach and try to destigmatize that, and just read. There's such smart scholars, including some people in this room, I think, who are doing amazing work that helps to connect some of the dots that I was talking about earlier. And it's key for all of us as people living in this country to really understand those connections and how the vulnerable can be affected.
Great. So we said quite a bit about Eubank's book. I just want to give you the title for that. It's Automate, or this was a title for her talk. I think does the book have the same title, Automating Inequality?
Automating Inequality.
Yeah, Automating Inequality, Virginia Eubanks. And as a last note, you are also a published author.
Oh.
So can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Oh, sure. I published my first novel in November. Thank you very much for asking. And for those who don't want to use Amazon, it is available through other means. But it's called Ways to Hide in Winter. And when I wrote it, it's actually rooted in my experience in working on issues related to intimate partner violence, which is the first thing I addressed when I was out of law school and working in the UK, and also tied to my hometown in rural Pennsylvania. And it's the story of a young woman who is struggling in lots of ways after a terrible accident that left her a widow at 22 and really struggling with the aftermath of a very violent relationship. So she's kind of built a zone of privacy and safety for herself in this lonely mountaintop general store. And then one day a mysterious stranger walks in. The mysterious stranger turns out to be an undocumented immigrant with a very interesting history, and I'll leave it at that. And so it becomes a kind of backward-looking and forward-looking mystery about their pasts, and then what you do when you realize someone you come to care about has done something terrible in their past. But I had spent 7 years working on this book and thought it had no privacy or surveillance connection at all. I thought this is a book that's fundamentally about domestic violence and particularly about the non-physical aspects of abuse, because I think that TV and films tend to represent domestic violence as the physical actions, and so we don't learn about the psychological abuse that can be just as devastating, or verbal abuse, sexual abuse, things that go on in relationships that are really harmful. But then I realized very belatedly that the book actually really is about privacy, that part of this person's recovery and her assertion of her own self-worth is kind of isolating herself and saying, I don't care what the small town thinks of me, and I'm going to remove myself from all these prying eyes, and I'm going to figure out who I am and reestablish my own dignity and think about my own goals. And so in its own way, again, you think about the connections between domestic violence, which often denies survivors their privacy. Abusers will monitor your email. They will monitor your calls. They will want to know where you went and why. And so reestablishing privacy is actually, I think, for domestic violence survivors, a form of empowerment. And so for me, the book has had some interesting connections that I didn't realize as I was writing it.
Right, and so if you want that, Literati is right down the street. So I'm sure they'd be happy to order it, or some other independent bookseller of your choice, if you must, Amazon, I suppose. But it's all good, right? So please join me in thanking Sarah.
So much. Thank you.